I'm about to tell you about one of those horrifying stories that will make your blood run cold. On that fateful evening of February 15, 2014, around 10:30 p.m., a distressing call came into the police department of the small town of Battleship, Michigan. A man who was driving along the highway reported that he had accidentally noticed a strange scene in the headlights, the motionless body of a young man lying right on the side of the road. Frightened, the driver slammed on the brakes and rushed to check if the young man was still alive. However, upon closer inspection, it turned out that he was no longer breathing. Moreover, the poor guy was half naked, which looked extremely odd and suspicious. With trembling hands, the man dialed 911 and informed the dispatcher about the gruesome discovery. The emergency services instantly responded and dispatched an ambulance and police officers to the scene. The dispatcher stayed on the line with the driver and gave valuable instructions on how to properly perform artificial respiration and chest compressions to try and save the boy. When the medics arrived, they detected a very weak pulse in the victim. The resuscitation team professionally carried out all the necessary resuscitation measures and urgently transported the young man to the hospital. Unfortunately, despite all the efforts of the experienced doctors, the young man's life was cut short, never regaining consciousness. And this is where things got really interesting. During a superficial examination of the body in the morgue, the experts could not identify any obvious cause of death. To establish the truth, it was necessary to conduct a full autopsy and examine all the circumstances in detail. You know, folks, having worked as a detective in the police force for many years, I've seen all sorts of things. But this story particularly struck me. Right now, I'll tell you all the details, but only to those incredible people who subscribe to the channel right now, like this video, and leave any comments so that as many people as possible can see this video. What I heard at the beginning of this story made me hold my breath. What was discovered during the body's examination shocked even experienced pathologists. During a thorough autopsy of the deceased young man's body, medical examiners found numerous abrasions, scratches, and bruises all over his body, especially in the head area. The nature of these injuries was very specific and indicated that the boy might have fallen out of a car at high speed or from a height. Fractures of the phalanges of the fingers were also recorded, as if he had desperately clung to something in the last moments of his life. However, the most terrifying and fatal injury was a severe traumatic brain injury with multiple skull fractures in several places at once. It was this injury that became the direct cause of death. What kind of beast could have dealt so cruelly and ruthlessly with a defenseless teenager? This question haunted me. Later, thanks to the documents found in the pockets of the bloodied clothes, the identity of the deceased was established. It turned out to be 19-year-old Dustin Louis Froka, a resident of the neighboring town of Owasso, Michigan. He was very young, born in June 1994 into an average American family to Sherry Froka and Louis Hinka. Unfortunately, Dustin's parents divorced when he was very little. His father soon remarried. The boy lived with his mother, but maintained a relationship and often visited his father and stepmother. In 2012, Dustin graduated from the local school and entered his sophomore year at Eastern Michigan University, where he chose business management as his specialty. It was not far from the campus that the student's mutilated body was found. Dustin, despite his young age, had already managed to become a father. Approximately a year before the tragedy, he had a baby daughter. True, the relationship with the girl's mother did not work out. They constantly quarreled and did not even live together. But despite everything, Dustin infinitely loved his little one and dreamed of providing her with a bright future. He was determined to succeed in life for the sake of his beloved daughter. In parallel with his studies, Dustin actively developed his music career. In the hip-hop world, he was known by the creative pseudonym Defro. It was an abbreviation of his full name. Our hero's affairs were on the rise. Very recently, he managed to sign a promising contract with an influential music producer. It seemed that just a little more and the young rapper would reach the coveted heights of fame. But Dustin's family and friends noticed alarming changes in his behavior. The boy's career successes somehow went hand in hand with constant partying, alcohol abuse, and marijuana. His life was gradually going downhill, which usually does not bode well. Who dared to so brutally cut short the life of a young man? Well, what we learned about Dustin's life next made me sympathize with him even more. It's not that simple. But as it turns out, not everything was so cloudless in Dustin's seemingly carefree life. Shortly before his tragic death, the young man managed to get into trouble with the law. At the end of January 2014, he was arrested for some offenses. Unfortunately, the details of that incident remained behind the scenes for me. After that, Dustin was shamefully kicked out of the university dormitory. The university administration believed that the problematic student posed a potential threat to other campus residents. The boy had to move in with friends for a while. Literally right before his death, Dustin sent a very strange and alarming tweet. It was about some illegal substances that caused strong hallucinations. The young man boasted that he was supposedly going to try it for the first time. In my opinion, this was a serious signal that something bad was happening in the boy's life. But unfortunately, no one attached due importance to this at the time. After the tragedy, during a search of Dustin's personal belongings, investigators found a large number of text messages and notes that also related to the topic of psychotropic drugs. Law enforcement officers carefully studied all mobile phones and other gadgets that belonged to the deceased. You know, modern technology is simply a treasure trove of information for cops. This way, you can find out more about a person than from the closest relatives and friends. In Dustin's correspondence, many suspicious dialogues were found with 3 other teenagers. Soon, all of them were identified and detained. This happened on February 22, exactly a week after the murder. The suspects included 18-year-old Tyrell Bernandes, his 16-year-old friend Brendan Haim, and their 18-year-old girlfriend Samantha Grik. Samantha was arrested right in her own car. The fact is that the investigation had reasonable suspicions that the same car was used directly during the commission of the crime. Therefore, the young person's vehicle was seized for a thorough inspection. And you know what? Intuition did not fail. The experienced operatives' traces of blood were found in the car's interior, confirming the version that Dustin was in this car on the night of the murder. Also, during a search of the car, a folding knife was seized, which could have been the murder weapon. Moreover, even the air in the cabin was permeated with the characteristic smell of marijuana. There were remnants of some illegal substances, the victim's personal belongings, and musical equipment. In other words, a full set of material evidence. The cops had to detain the other 2 suspects at their place of residence in their own apartments. The information about the relationship between the persons involved in the case added unexpected twists to the story, which were completely unexpected for me personally. Listen carefully. We managed to find out some interesting details about the detained teenagers. It turns out that they were all well acquainted with each other and studied together at the same high school. At the time of the tragedy, the girl, Samantha, was just finishing her school education. One of the detained boys, it seems it was Tyrell, had already managed to graduate from school the year before and even entered university. The other participant in this story, Brendan, was also approaching graduation from high school. By studying the seized messengers on their mobile devices, investigators gradually began to reconstruct the chronology of events on that fateful evening. Judging by how actively this youth company communicated, it could be concluded that all of them were somehow involved in Dustin's murder. But what especially caught the eye was the frequent correspondence between the victim and Samantha. These 2 began an intensive exchange of messages literally a few weeks before the boy's death. It was this communication that became the key to unraveling the motives behind this horrific crime. By the way, this Samantha was quite an extraordinary personality. Still very young, she had already managed to become the soloist of a local rock band. In 2012, she even performed at some popular music festival in Ann Arbor. They say the girl had a powerful voice and stunning charisma on stage. She also had high hopes in show business and was on the verge of fame. Although, judging by everything, rebellious notes were already manifesting in Samantha's character at that time. Investigators put forward a version that Samantha, together with her friends, decided to get drugs and money the easy way. They knew that Dustin had cash and carried illegal substances with him. It is quite likely that the couple agreed to meet somewhere on the outskirts and then simply robbed the boy and brutally dealt with him so as not to leave witnesses. As they say, no man, no problem. It seems incredible, but after committing this gruesome murder, the young inhumans even tried to cover their tracks. According to operational data, the criminals took the bloodied things out of the city to some town of Lodi and burned them there. Unfortunately, when the cops got there, they could not find anything. The criminals did an excellent job. The experts never managed to restore a complete and clear picture of what happened. But the collected evidence was definitely enough to bring charges against this trio. The detainees were facing a hefty sentence. Each of them was threatened with life imprisonment for first-degree premeditated murder and armed robbery, plus conspiracy to commit these crimes. The boys were definitely facing a residence in a state-owned house with bars on the windows. But Samantha decided to cooperate with the investigation. The girl was the first to make a deal with justice and began to testify against her former friends. Thanks to the deal with the investigation, the girl was able to reduce her sentence for cooperation. She will be tried only for unintentional murder and robbery without the use of weapons. This will give her a chance to be released on parole, of course, if she provides the most truthful testimony against her accomplices. What the victim had to go through in the last minutes of his life is beyond description, but it's nothing compared to what happened next. The testimony of the main suspect shed light on many gruesome details of this brutal murder of the young rap star. So get comfortable, I'll tell you everything now. According to Samantha, on February 15, the day of the tragedy, she received a call from Brendan somewhere in the evening. The guy asked her to urgently give him a ride to the east of Lansing, the capital of our state. Allegedly, they had an appointment there with Tyrell, after which the whole company was supposed to break into Dustin's apartment. Interestingly, the girl did not even begin to delve into the details of their insidious plan. She simply agreed to fulfill the role of a taxi driver and was already at the place in a few minutes. The two guys quickly got into the car, and Samantha had to wait for them a few blocks away from the desired building. But as they say, man proposes, but God disposes. Something went wrong, and Samantha's friends didn't find the amount they were counting on in Dustin's apartment. They had to call for help. They forcibly pushed the poor musician into Samantha's car and began to demand money. After driving around the city, stopping at several ATMs, it seemed that everything was settled. At least none of the trio showed any particular aggression. But suddenly, when Dustin already thought that everything was over, and they drove up to his house to let him go, Brendan pounced on him from behind. Without further ado, he began to fiercely beat his victim with brass knuckles on the head and face. At some point, Dustin realized that they were about to beat him to death. A crazy thought flashed through his head. He needed to jump out of the car that was rushing at about 100 kilometers per hour. Despite the fact that he had already managed to receive several devastating blows that completely clouded his consciousness, Dustin still decided to take this desperate step. With his last strength, he opened the car door and pushed himself out with all his might. Perhaps the last thing that flashed through his mind was the hope of salvation, or maybe the thirst for life. Samantha claimed that she stopped the car as soon as she heard that something was wrong, but not in order to provide assistance to the victim, no. The other two fell out like jackals, rummaged through the pockets of the barely alive, bleeding Dustin. They quickly took out all the cash he had on him, about $800. They grabbed the prohibited substances, and then, as if for good measure, they dragged the poor guy a little more on the ribs with their feet, and they fled, leaving him to die on the road on a cold February night. From that moment on, Dustin no longer had any chance of returning home alive. Wounded, robbed, humiliated, he passed away alone, far from his cozy home, from his loved ones and little daughter. And you know what struck me the most in this story? The fact that for her service, Samantha received a paltry $100 from the killers. $100. That's how much her life cost that night. Small change for gas, no more. The prosecutor stated that this diabolical scheme was carefully thought out the day before. So on February 14, when all of America was celebrating Valentine's Day, these scumbags gathered for a party. Apparently, there was not enough money for booze or a dose, so Samantha's friends called her and suggested robbing Dustin. Everyone knew that he had both cash and drugs. Although the girl herself was not present at the party, under the influence of the crowd, she agreed to this beastly plan. At first, they presented it as if it was going to be a minor prank, or at most a robbery, like we'll scare the guy a little and take what we need. No one directly voiced the intention to kill Dustin that evening. But this is only the tip of the iceberg, because the speeches of the relatives of the deceased brought tears to my eyes. Samantha's lawyer, however, had a slightly different opinion about her guilt. During the court hearing, he repeatedly stated that the tragedy could have been avoided if Dustin himself had not decided to jump out of the moving car. Thus, the defender seemed to hint that the deceased was to some extent to blame for what happened. Also, the lawyer tried in every possible way to portray his client as almost an angel in the flesh. They say that before this fatal case, the girl had no problems with the law. Samantha studied hard, had remarkable vocal talent, and could well have made a brilliant career in show business. The defender really wanted to present her more as a victim of circumstances who simply found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Drawn into trouble by cunning tempters, nothing else. But unfortunately, the halo of holiness cracked at the first detailed look at Samantha's personality. In addition to direct participation in the robbery and murder, Miss Grik liked to drive under the influence and with illegal substances in the glove compartment. She also practiced self-medication with psychotropic drugs dispensed with fake prescriptions. That is, she had really serious problems with drugs. And you know what most outraged the relatives of the deceased? The fact that during her last word, Samantha, sniffling, so easily apologized for what she had done. As if it was not a cold-blooded murder, but a minor prank that can be redeemed with a few tears. Like she was just sitting behind the wheel, and the rest was done by the guys, so she kind of has nothing to do with it. Dustin's mother, who was present at the hearing, did not believe a single word she said. No matter how many times this hypocrite repeated how sorry she was about the tragedy, the woman knew that Samantha could and should have stopped this madness. She had every opportunity to dissuade her friends from this insidious plan to prevent them from harming her son. The girl was one step away from saving a human life. Instead, she gave tacit consent, allowing events to unfold in the worst-case scenario. Moreover, this person had 100 chances to call an ambulance as soon as Dustin, bloody and beaten, jumped out of her car. Who, if not Samantha, knew that he needed immediate medical attention? If she had not been afraid of the anger of her friends and made one simple call to 911, it is quite possible that the young father would now be alive. And because of such inaction of one person, how many others are forced to suffer? Dustin's prematurely widowed mother, orphan sister, but worst of all, a little girl who is only 10 months old, will never know how incredible, bright, and musically gifted her father was. Because of the senseless cruelty of a bunch of young men, she is doomed to grow up without parental care and support. At the autopsy, Dustin was found to have a double skull fracture, the result of a brutal beating with brass knuckles in the car. Combined with the injuries sustained when falling out of the car at a speed of 100 km/h, the poor guy had no chance of survival. Dustin's loved ones made no secret of it. They demanded the most severe punishment for Samantha, even though her guilt in premeditated murder was not proven. During the hearing, they again and again mentioned the orphan baby, who would never know what a wonderful guy her father was. Samantha, in their opinion, lived her life in such a way that she deprived Dustin of all the opportunities and prospects that she herself allegedly aspired to. And then came the crucial moment, the day of the verdict. Before announcing her decision, the judge read out several letters that had been sent to her address by concerned citizens. I must honestly admit that in my work in the police, I rarely encountered such active public involvement. But this high-profile case, it seems, left no one indifferent. Some of the letter writers called for leniency towards Samantha. Like young, stupid, got involved with the guys who doesn't have that happen. In contrast, many people wanted the girl to languish behind bars for the rest of her days. I especially remember a letter from an ardent fan of the deceased rapper. He sincerely wished for Samantha to burn in hell. A loud statement, to say the least. In the end, the court found the former soloist of the local rock band guilty and sentenced her to 15 years in prison. However, in 6 years she will have the right to file a petition for parole. Well, what did you want? The sincerity of her repentance and willingness to cooperate with the investigation did not go unnoticed by Themis. Interestingly, even the grieving relatives of the victim agreed with this verdict. However, they made no secret of the fact that deep down they hoped that the punishment for the young killer would be much more severe. But in general, the relatives acknowledged that all three involved in the tragedy received more or less adequate retribution. But you know what most testified to the sincerity of Samantha's repentance? Her behavior on social networks after the arrest. Instead of curbing her ambitions and keeping a low profile, the young rock diva actively posted some abstract messages on her page. It seemed that she was not at all concerned about the fate of the deceased and her role in this tragedy. The apotheosis of cynicism was a post in which Samantha boasted about her new tattoo. The inscription cream adorned her body, which meant, "Cash rules everything around me." An eloquent slogan for a person who, due to the thirst for easy money, got involved in murder. The most paradoxical thing is that literally a few days before getting into this terrible mess, the girl had a very real chance to sign a lucrative contract with a solid music label. She was scheduled for an audition that could have been her star hour. Instead, with one fatal decision, Samantha crossed out her entire professional future. However, according to the prosecution and the victim's relatives, even the senseless waste of prospects is not comparable to the severity of the crime she committed that night. Her role in Dustin's death was too great to be easily forgiven and let go with peace. The only thing Samantha can count on is parole at the age of 24. And believe me, for a girl with such a bouquet of offenses, this is quite an optimistic schedule. But this is not the main character of our story, because the story of Tyrell's illegal behavior made me hold my head. Let's talk in more detail about Tyrell, one of the direct participants in this terrible crime. Believe me, every employee in the department knew this name like their own. In just 14 months before the tragedy, patrol officers visited this scumbag's home at least 8 times. Yes, you heard right, on average. It turns out to be about 1 visit every 2 months. You must agree, even for a not very law-abiding citizen, this is too much. And you know what's most interesting? During each such raid, the police had every reason to bring Tyrell to justice for minor offenses. But every time this juvenile scumbag somehow managed to slip out of the hands of justice. Not otherwise, the boy had a dizzying luck. One of the most striking examples happened on December 3, 2013. That's when the judge, without thinking about the possible consequences, showed unjustified leniency. The young man was sentenced to 3 months in prison for breaking into someone else's car. It would seem to be a completely innocent prank. The poor fellow just wanted to steal some little things worth about $200. But instead of sending the little scumbag to jail, the judge limited himself to a suspended sentence. Like, don't ruin the child's life, give him a chance to reform. What kind of chance? What kind of correction? This thief went back to his old ways as soon as he left the courtroom. And so, less than a month passed and our hero was already strutting in front of the servants of Themis again. Now he was accused of numerous violations of the conditions of the probationary period. For this, he was already facing a much more serious punishment, real years behind bars. But a miracle happened again. The next judge, for some reason, refrained from enforcing the sentence until the next hearing, scheduled for February 24. And here, my friends, the most interesting begins. You won't believe it, but during the time that passed between the two trials, the young scoundrel managed to commit the most terrible thing to take a human life. It was he who became one of the main initiators and perpetrators of the brutal murder of Dustin. This high-profile story caused quite a public outcry. Outraged citizens raised a completely fair question: if the servants of Themis had shown principle in time and put the juvenile bandit behind bars, Dustin could now be alive. Isn't this the kind of crime prevention we all dream of? Of course, after the tragedy, the judge who released Tyrell sang a familiar tune in one voice. Like I wanted the best, hoped to give the young man a chance to reform. He assured that he had held educational conversations with him, tried to guide him on the path of truth. Believed in the best, so to speak. But unfortunately, Tyrell proved with all his behavior that he is incorrigible and extremely dangerous to society. So now his place is behind bars, and that's it. During one of the hearings, the prosecutor could not stand it, and in a fit of anger reproached Tyrell, saying that due to his boundless lies and cynicism, an irreparable tragedy occurred, and that instead of learning at least some lesson, the scumbag only covers his tracks and wriggles out. So now he will have to carry the brand of a killer despised by the whole society for the rest of his life. You know what's the strangest thing? Even after these passionate accusatory speeches, the judge continued to believe in Tyrell's bright soul. But you know what's most amazing in this story? Even when it seemed that Tyrell was about to end up behind bars, fate seemed to give him chance after chance to avoid punishment. You won't believe it, but just 3 days before Dustin's murder, a complaint about our hero appeared on the police doorstep again. And from whom do you think? From his own neighbor who lived on the floor below. This poor woman complained that someone from the upstairs apartment was throwing garbage right onto her balcony. The wind picked up these gifts and scattered the dirt all over the entrance. The neighbor went outside to check who the slob was behaving so swinishly. And who did she see in the window? That's right, Tyrell himself in the company of some dubious friends. The outraged woman, of course, expressed her claims to this young man. Well, what do you think our quiet guy did in response? He threw an empty beer bottle at the poor neighbor. And by the way, he almost hit her on the head. Not only did he arrange a garbage dump on someone else's balcony, but he also threatened. That's the kind of gratitude for the remark. You understand that even this incident would have been enough to send Tyrell behind bars. By that time, he had repeatedly violated the conditions of the probationary period, and here's also an attempt on the health of a citizen. Well, tell me, doesn't society dream of getting rid of such scum? Police officers who were dealing with the case of this juvenile offender immediately went to the familiar address. On February 12, they were already standing on the threshold of Tyrell's apartment to seriously talk about his antics. But no one opened the door for them. Well, it's clear such cowards always hide from just punishment. So the cops decided to wait for a while in the patrol car in the parking lot. They hoped that the young rascal would still come out of the apartment and they would be able to detain him. But the hours passed and the suspect never appeared. Later, the law enforcement officers figured it out apparently. He got wind that they were waiting for him and decided to sit it out. Tell me, isn't this an outrageous situation? Here he is, a painfully familiar character, a juvenile bandit whom the cops could have brought to justice so many times over the past year. The whole block is groaning from him, neighbors are afraid to go outside, and law enforcement officials throw up their hands. There is not enough evidence, they say, to break down the door and arrest the scumbag. Like an attempt on the health of citizens is not yet a reason to damage the property of taxpayers. As a result, the law enforcement officers simply left with nothing. Unfortunately, none of them even suspected that the very next day, this inhuman would do something that would shake the whole country, and that after this, the cops would have to return to the familiar address, but with much more serious charges. However, even when Tyrell was finally detained and charged with Dustin's murder, he denied his guilt to the last. But this stubbornness did not last long. Eventually, the young inhuman still realized that it was better to cooperate with the investigation and try to mitigate his participation. So, putting on a pious face, Tyrell began to testify. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and promised to reveal all the details of that terrible night. And then something incredible began at all. It turns out that our repentant decided to shift all the blame to his buddy Brendan. Like it was Brendan who planned the robbery of the rapper, and he also wanted to mock him. And Tyrell himself just modestly sat on the side in the car and watched as his friend takes out brass knuckles and begins to beat the defenseless musician who was sitting next to him in the passenger seat. And so when the beaten Dustin tried to escape from the torment and jumped out of the car on the move, barely alive, Tyrell also rushed to provide him with first aid. Oh, sorry, I misspoke. He actually rushed to search the bloodied victim along with his accomplices. He rummaged through the pockets of the dying young man, took off valuable things, somewhere even managed to steal shoes. And what about medical assistance, you ask? What about saving a human life? But do such scumbags need this? The main thing for them is not to light up, to grab the valuables and to take to their heels. That's what our inhumans did. They stupidly fled from the crime scene, leaving Dustin to bleed on the side of the road. I'm sorry, I just feel pain. Forgive me for being emotional. I should restrain myself more. It's just that, damn it. These are not even fully formed people. The milk on their lips has not dried yet, and they are already doing such things. When I was their age, I was herding cattle on Uncle Ethan's ranch in Ohio to earn $20. Let's return to the final part of this horrific story. The court found Tyrell guilty of Dustin's murder and sentenced him to 38 years in prison. A rather severe sentence for an 18-year-old guy, don't you think? But on the other hand, he completely deserved it. In addition, Tyrell still has a chance to be released earlier after 25 years at the age of 43. He will have the right to file a petition for parole. Frankly, I'm not sure if it's worth releasing such dangerous types. But his 16-year-old friend Brendan did something even more cunning. Despite his young age, he did not get confused and made a deal with the prosecutor. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for the promise of a milder punishment. But you know what's most interesting? As it turned out during the investigation, it was this snot-nosed kid who is the ideological mastermind of this whole terrible story. At least, that's what his older comrades unanimously stated. You just think about it. Back on February 14, this nice boy gathered his best friends at home and began to discuss a plan to attack Dustin. Like the rapper has money and they have to somehow get these funds. They seem to plan to just drive the musician in a car, force him to withdraw cash at several ATMs. Yeah, like in a good way, without any crime. But as it turned out, Brendan had much harsher intentions from the very beginning. Literally on the way, he pounced on Dustin with his fists, began to mercilessly beat the guy, not giving him any chance of salvation. It was these beatings that became fatal, coupled with injuries from falling out of the car at speed. At the trial, Brendan, of course, repented and apologized to the relatives of the deceased. Like, I didn't want this, forgive the fool. But when the judge asked about the motives for such cruelty, the boy could not give a clear answer. He just wanted to arrange a bloody orgy, and that's it. By the way, during the investigation, it became known that Brendan's parents had long noticed their son's inadequate behavior. His uncontrolled outbursts of aggression frightened even the closest people. The worried relatives planned to consult a psychiatrist to find out what was going on with their child. However, unfortunately, they did not have time to do this. They did not have time to prevent a terrible tragedy. So it's not surprising that it was Brendan who received the most severe sentence, as much as 60 years behind bars. True, they also left him a loophole for early release in 32 years. That is, already in adulthood. If he behaves well, he will be able to get out of jail. But something tells me that this is unlikely to happen. Interestingly, Dustin's parents were quite satisfied with the verdicts for the two main defendants in the case. But they were extremely outraged by the humanity towards Samantha. Like, the girl is actually an accomplice in the murder, but she got off with some miserable 15 years, and she can even be released early. Where is the justice here? However, Dustin's mother was most impressed, watching the behavior of these young men in the courtroom. At one point, the woman could not stand it and asked through tears, "Why? Well, why did you do this?" She could not understand how it was possible for the sake of a few miserable bills to so cruelly cut short the life of a guy who had just become a father. How did they even raise a hand to do this? It hurt her terribly to realize that this trio of scumbags, for the sake of instant profit, crossed out not only Dustin's fate, but also mercilessly destroyed the lives of all his loved ones. A mother lost her son, a daughter lost a loving father, friends lost a talented and promising comrade. And all this for what? To buy a dose of drugs or to have a great time at a club? Is a human life so cheap now? On this sad note, we end our story. At the moment, all of Dustin's killers are still rotting behind bars, and they will not be released in the near future. Isn't this the best news for today? What do you think? Thank you, friends, for being with me and listening to this difficult story. I'm sure it left no one indifferent. If you want to share your own thoughts or impressions, you are welcome to comment. There you can also leave a like if you find such information useful and informative. But most importantly, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes. All the best, bye, and remember, no matter how bad the situation may seem, there is always a way out. The main thing is not to give up and believe in justice, then everything will be fine. Your Detective Brooks.